You're tuned in to The Andrew Lawton Show.
Let's go back to the basics here. I want to talk to someone who was there at the very beginning when he was the Premier of Newfoundland and Labrador when the Charter of Rights and Freedoms was being drafted, the last surviving of the premiers involved in that very significant process in Canadian history. That is former Newfoundland Premier Brian Peckford, who joins me now. Brian, it's wonderful to talk to you. Thanks very much for your time today.
Thank you for having me. I'm more than pleased to help clarify the whole business about the Charter of Rights and Freedoms.
This is something that, again, we're coming up on the 40th anniversary of, and I think we'll have to have you back around then to talk about the legacy of the Charter. But the one fundamental thing that people have viewed in the Charter all throughout its history is that it's there to protect the rights of Canadians. And we have in that freedom of expression, mobility. All of these things have been under an increasing threat from government in the last year and a half. And when you see the Charter that you left behind as part of your political legacy and you see what's been happening, how do you reconcile those two visions?
I can't reconcile those two visions, and I'm sure that if any of the other First Ministers were still alive, they would voice the same kind of shock and surprise as I do to see how callously the governments, not individuals or organizations or somebody who's trying to undermine our society or some anarchist somewhere, but the actual governments whose predecessors participated in forming and creating this Charter of Rights and Freedoms in the Constitution Act of 1982. So I am absolutely shocked and have been writing about it extensively for the last couple of years, highlighting the fact that what the governments are doing violates, at least 4 different sections of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, Section 2, Section 6, Section 7, and Section 15, all of which deal with freedoms and rights, equality rights, freedom of assembly, freedom of association, freedom of expression, freedom to move around the country, freedom to have a job. A right, it's a right to have a job. Your rights are supposed to be protected, and yet jobs are being taken away from people. Governments are doing this willy-nilly. The parliaments are not involved anymore. This is the other part of the equation that a lot of people are forgetting. I thought this was a parliamentary democracy. Parliamentary democracy means, by its very definition, you go through the parliament for all these things. So it seems to me that the Parliament of Canada and the parliaments of all of the other jurisdictions, by the way, there are 14 parliaments in Canada, when you include the territories, the 3 territories, 10 provinces and the federal government. These should be open, and these should be debating the provisions that the government is suggesting should be brought in to mitigate the virus called the COVID-19. And there should be a full and healthy debate by the representatives of the people. So not only is the Charter of Rights being violated, but the whole custom, convention, and parliamentary democracy principles are being violated and abused in what is now happening and what has been happening for the last almost 2 years now.
There's a tremendous backlog in the courts of challenges of everything ranging from individual fines that people have received under lockdown measures to very large programs like hotel quarantine, vaccine mandates, all of this. But in the cases that have been litigated, courts have, generally speaking, taken a very wide interpretation of the very first section of the Charter, which is very familiar certainly to you and to a lot of Canadians by now, that says that all of the other rights you have can be limited by government. And I knew that, and by the courts, and I know that you wrote a letter to premiers about this, and you basically said, Section 1 is not protecting you as much as you think it is.
Section 1 says that the federal government or the provinces have to demonstrably justify what they are doing within reasonable limits in a free and democratic society by law. They have not demonstrably justified what they are doing. And therefore, in my view, everybody else is being silent on this. Everybody else is I haven't heard any law societies, I haven't heard any law professors or political science people. Everybody's going silent. There's a sort of a collective psychosis or amnesia in the country where nobody wants to speak up on this. They have not demonstrably justified. I mean, I can read the words I don't have to be a constitutional lawyer. I was involved in the constitution making, and so I have a fair amount of experience in that over like almost 2 years when we were negotiating the Constitution Act. So I do have some experience. I do have some knowledge of words and what is put in a constitution. And I've been studying this ever since it was created back in 1981. So I feel I have some authority on this. And therefore, I know what demonstrably justify means. You have to justify demonstrably. In other words, you have to be quite open and transparent, and you have to have great evidence. And what the governments have not done is that they have not allowed through their parliaments or through any hearings competing views on the medical science that is driving these lockdowns and these mandates and so on. And the mere fact that they haven't, that means they have not demonstrably justified the positions they are taking. So in my view, if this ever gets to the Supreme Court of Canada, if there's any independence left at all in the judiciary, and that's where it would reside right now, I submit, then it seems to me they would have to rule a lot of these measures to be unconstitutional. Now, they may put in place other measures or say you can do A and you can do B, but you can't do C and D, or we'll put a time frame on this, or you give me more evidence before I make a final decision, right? They could do all of those things. But and the other thing I've said to the premiers in an open letter is there is a measure to expedite this through the courts. Nobody's talking about this either. And that is provincial or federal reference. Every government of Canada, provinces and the federal government can take their measures and refer directly to their highest court. In the case of the provinces, it's their appeal court. In the case of the federal government, it's the Supreme Court of Canada. And they could ask those courts, is what we are doing following the Constitution of this country? Is it following the Charter of Rights and Freedoms? Not one has done it. I've submitted an open letter to all premiers asking them, why won't you refer what you're doing to your courts to get a decision so that the people of Canada know you're being constitutional? Not one premier has answered me. Not one premier has answered me. And I find that shocking, that not even the courtesy to respond to somebody who was involved in the Constitution in the beginning, especially the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. So there are measures available. A lot of people are frustrated. But if a province of Canada did what I'm saying and referred this to their appeal court, do you think the appeal court would sit on that? Not on your life. They would know right away as a signal by these governments, they want to know, whether we're constitutional. They would take that up immediately, make an adjudication. Then that province could refer directly to the Supreme Court of Canada. They can go directly to the Supreme Court of Canada. So those two courts could, within 6 months, just say, give it an outside of a year, make a decision. Not the 3 or 4 years that we're into now with them going through the courts by organizations and individuals and so on, because in the regular course of business, it has to go to the trial division of the Supreme Court of a province, then to the appeal division of the Supreme Court of the province, then to the Supreme Court of Canada. So that can be shortened immeasurably, especially if a government initiated it, because then the courts would be seized with knowing they need a quick decision.
I don't disagree with you, but I think the two issues there are firstly that a lot of provinces know that what they're doing is not constitutional and they don't want to put it through that scrutiny. But also I have not a lot of optimism that the courts are going to be on the right side of this. And to go back to Section 1 for a moment, we've seen in a number of constitutional charter litigation cases and even more recently on some of the COVID lockdown related litigation that again, courts are taking government at its word that COVID is kind of a trump card that you can use to suspend civil liberties. They're not worried about the inherent constraints of Section 1. So the general question I guess I'll put to you, Brian, is when that was being drafted and when that was being considered, was there a little bit more optimism about how the judiciary would use that power?
No question. Nobody. And I would say those people who are still alive, who were deputy ministers, advisors to the various governments, there's quite a few of them still alive, should be coming out and saying what I'm saying. I don't think there was anybody in that room at the time, or in the various rooms of the various delegations, who thought that this would happen at this point in time, even in the public emergency, so-called. so-called. The
So
Alberta
Section 1 was never meant to be a trump card for what we're seeing now.
Well, but it's a protection because it's demonstrably justified, and they haven't done that. They're using that, but it cannot be, that's not a valid use of that section. So they're still violating the Constitution. So that's how I interpret it. Yes, they might try to use it as a trump card, but it's a false trump card. It's a false trump card because where is the justification demonstrably made? Nowhere. All they've done is gone ahead with their provisions with no justification in those provisions what they did. And by the way, in Alberta, there's a court case by the Centre of Constitutional Freedoms, and they've been trying to get the evidence from the Alberta government. And the Alberta government has been refraining from providing the evidence, by the way, that they were supposed to have for the decisions they made a year and a half ago. So to say they don't have it, or it's going to take us time to prepare it, is absolutely specious and doesn't pass muster. So that's a good example of one government that's very afraid to come forward with the evidence. Evidence has not been presented to justify what the governments are doing, and they have that obligation under Section 1 to do so.
You've been a premier. You understand the political implications of your actions, and you also understand, of course, working within the bureaucracy and having some forces in government and in deputy ministers that want to push and pull you every which way. But a lot of these premiers, it seems like they're listening to the public health experts that they cite, and a lot of them are only interested in lockdowns. They're not interested in exploring the economic implications, the civil liberties implications, and all of these other things. And I guess I'm just curious why you think a lot of these premiers have narrowed their focus so much to only really pull advice from one source and one source only as they're drafting these measures.
I find it very disturbing. Obviously, one of the answers is very poor leadership in this country right now. Obviously, leaders are to take advice, but after taking advice, then they're to go away and make up their own minds, both the cabinet and the ministers and the premier or prime minister. That doesn't look like it's happening now. But it's blatant, Andrew. I mean, there's the Great Barrington Declaration. How long has that been out there? And they tried to malign the three greatest experts in the world who signed that Barrington Declaration, saying that these lockdowns are not going to work. And, some tens of thousands of doctors and research scientists around the world. That's being completely ignored. So it's not only on the narrow scale, but on the broader scale. They're not even taking that into consideration. So once again, I come back to number one is the lack of leadership. There's no question about it that most of the leaders of this country today have failed the test of leadership, have failed the test of their premiership, have failed the test of their prime ministership. And it comes down now, unfortunately, to civil society. It comes down to you and me and others, and thank you for giving me this opportunity to articulate an alternative view, not to be against vaccines, generally speaking, but be against one that has not proven its worth in any testing because it's still experimental and is damaging killing tens of thousands of people, according to the government records themselves, both in the United States and Europe. And therefore, we should be far more cautious, and we should be taking a broader view of the guidance and expertise that we're supposed to do as good leaders, and we're not doing that. And so I think that there's a failure of leadership, number one, but there's also failure by civil society, by our business leaders, by our union leaders, by our academic leaders to come forward. And the other problem with that is our democracy has been failing for quite some time. This is a catalyst that sort of manifests it more open so more people see it, okay? It's been failing for a long while, especially since Pierre Elliott Trudeau Sr., when he started to develop a bigger prime minister's office. The power has been moving from the MPs. The power has been moving from the parliament. Power went, first of all, to the cabinet with the prime minister. Now it's gone all the way to the prime minister. And there's a book out that people should read by Donald Savoy entitled Democracy in Canada, the Disintegration of Our Institutions. And he tracks this evolution of the diminution of power from the parliament to the prime minister's office over time. And so we have been gradually losing our democracy. And this so-called pandemic, this virus, has manifested all of the scars that we allowed to happen over the last 3 or 4 decades, sadly. And so there's a real leadership vacuum, not only at the political level, but at the academic, business, and union level. In other words, our civic society is broken, and we need to fix it soon in order to get back the democracy that we're losing now every day.
Just as we close here, and you look back, as I mentioned, on almost 40 years of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and still a country that has devolved into the things you and I have been chatting about for the time we've been discussing things. Do you feel that the Charter is still the tool it was intended to be, or do you feel, looking back, like there was something missing from it?
No, I don't think there's anything missing from it. All of the elements are there. Remember, we had the Bill of Rights before the Charter. John Diefenbaker introduced the Bill of Rights. So we
still do, technically.
Well, it is as a federal law, but the whole idea of the Charter was to put it in the Constitution so it would be further away from being able to be changed. That was the whole idea. We already had a Charter. All the ideas that are in the Charter were in the Bill of Rights that Mr. Diefenbaker passed, but it was a federal act of Parliament and therefore was subject to change by any majority government that came in. Could be changed very easily. But by putting it in the Constitution, we all thought, everybody thought, that therefore it's very difficult to change now, and therefore we have our rights and freedoms protected, only to find out today that we don't.
Well, on that grim note, I guess it shows that, as you mentioned, we have to, in civil society, be the ones to stand up for our freedoms first and foremost. Former Newfoundland Premier Brian Peckford, thank you so much, sir, for joining me. It's a pleasure to speak with you.
Andrew, it's a pleasure to speak to you. Thank you very much.
Thanks for listening to The Andrew Lawton Show. Support the program by donating to True North at www.tnc.news.